All right, now that we've gotten the basics of SVG terminology out of the way, let's talk a little bit about how we can add and manipulate those SVG images within Pinegrow. There are a number of great programs out there for drawing SVG images like Figma, GIMP, Inkscape, also Adobe Illustrator. But we can also access a wealth of different SVG images on the web that have very liberal licenses. Within the Pinegrow templates, we use resources from pages like SVG Repo, Logo Ipsum, Isometric, and Flexible. So all of these are linked in the main written tutorial and again have great licenses to allow for use in your own projects. So no matter what framework is being used, SVG files can be dragged from the project panel onto the page. This will add them onto the page with an image tag with this file name as source. So you can see here I have an assets folder. Within that assets folder, I have a folder of SVGs. Then I can just take this element, just drag it right over. In this case, I'm going to drag it into my page inside this div. That will add it to the page. We can see it's being added in an image with a source set to the file name. That can be edited or, changed here on the properties panel like we would for any image, where we can just click on the folder and change which file. You'll also notice that it's taking up more than the div that it was dragged into. This is typical behavior for images. Depending on what framework we're using, we can choose to constrain this in different ways. Within Bootstrap, we can choose to constrain it by adding a class of image fluid to it. Within Tailwinds, there's a similar type of class that can be added. But basically, in both cases, what we're doing is just saying that we can constrain either the width or the height to a maximum of 100%. And again, bringing them in as an image, as we did here, basically embedding them, they act just like normal images, and they will maintain their aspect ratio unless you go out of your way to force them not to maintain that aspect ratio. So the other way we can add these, so let's go ahead, go back to our tree. We'll go ahead and delete this. So the other way we can add an SVG in as an inline instead of an embedded is we can go ahead and click on that SVG here in our asset folder. We can then just click down in our code box, quickly select it all, copy it, then switch over to our library panel, and then within the insert code box, we'll just go ahead and paste all that code. That'll then bring up this element that can be dragged to the page, just like we did with our file from our assets folder. So we can just drag that right over. We're going to put it in the same div. You can see it pretty much acts the same. However, now in this case, we're no longer working with an image. So rather than toggle that image fluid, what we're going to do is go into the properties panel and look to see what this width and height is. So I'm just going to delete that, and then I'm going to put this to 100%. So that's again going to take up the entire width of this div that I put. And when the page resizes, it's going to cause that SVG to resize. And right now, our default of preserve aspect ratio is on, so it's going to preserve our height and width of that SVG as we resize our page. Basically, I've shown you now two different ways to put our SVG file to the page. We can either embed it using the image element, and in that case, it behaves essentially like any other image file. Their size is controlled by the normal width and height CSS properties or image attributes. And the SVG is going to maintain its aspect ratio. So you don't have to worry about either the viewport or the view box. So in that case, why would you want to use inline SVG images? Well, there's some big advantages. The biggest advantage of using inline SVG is that you can then use CSS as well as JavaScript to easily modify that SVG. If you don't like the colors, you can just change them. You want to animate it with either CSS animations or Pinegrow interaction or some other JavaScript manipulation? No problem. Want to add a hover effect? Just use CSS. So this is different than if you use them embedded. Once they're embedded, hover effects become more difficult since we don't normally treat images to hover effects the same way. It's not as easy to animate, not as easy to change the color. Okay, let's just open up a new page here really quickly to make my next point about SVGs. So go ahead and open this. All right, so the other thing that is an argument for inlining, or at least not an argument against inlining, is that if you look at the size of SVGs compared with most images, like JPEGs or even PNGs, they're relatively small. And even though while they're loading, they'll block any render until they load in, the small size means that they load fairly quickly. So this is just the agency template within the Bootstrap box, and it has 28 inline SVG images. So it's got this really complicated one up top here. All these logos are SVG. Each one of these different icons is SVG. And there's a total of 28 of them, as I said. Yet the overall page size, and this is a full page, the overall page size, if served with gzip compression on, is only 150 KB. So that's quite a bit smaller than what the sort of recommended page size is for quick loads. And then best of all, it only requires a single HTTP request to get all of the images, as opposed to the 28 requests plus the page requests that would be required using HTTP 1.1. So each of these request dialogues is that browser going to the server, going through a handshake and a negotiation before the data transfer. And this requires a large number of milliseconds, especially if you add them up for 28 different requests. So that's going to lengthen your page load time. Granted, the newer HTTP 2 has parallelization of requests, but it's still not fully embraced by the entire internet. Okay, so what disadvantages are there to inlining your SVG? As outlined, they do block page load. So if you have a really large file, it probably would be a better idea to embed it as opposed to inlining it. That way you can do something like a lazy load. The other potential disadvantage is that it does make your code look a little messy. So if we click on this and look, you know, that's kind of a big mess of code. But luckily, if we want to, we can just identify the top of the SVG and just fold that code. And before you know it, our code is easy to work with. So that's not too bad of a disadvantage. The final disadvantage is that inlining your SVG instead of embedding means they can't be cached. So returning visitors to your site will end up using bandwidth to download the images again. This is a judgment call regarding how many times you expect visitors to be returning to the same pages. One perceived disadvantage of inlining your SVG that goes along with this is that if you use the same image in multiple places, the browser will have to download that same code multiple times. So you might want to use, say, the logo for the company multiple times on the pages. So this actually isn't true. You can define SVG on one section of the code and then reuse that throughout the same page. So overall, in most cases, there really isn't much of a downside to inlining your SVG, but in the end, it really is a personal choice. Okay, so if you choose to inline your SVG, you can easily use CSS to change colors within the SVG. There are a couple of ways to do this. And if you look in Pinegrow, if you have the SVG selected and go to the Properties panel, you can see that there's these two checkboxes, Fill with Current Color and Stroke with Current Color. So Fill with Current Color basically is selecting whichever color, whichever crayon from the box you want to use to color in between the lines. So if we go ahead and check this on, you see it turns blue. The reason why is because in this case I'm in Bootstrap, and you can see that within the text panel of Bootstrap I've selected the primary color here, which is a blue. If we choose a danger color, you can see that that fill turns to red. We can also pick success color. Whatever text color we select is going to color that fill. Similarly, if we're in Tailwind, we can do the same thing. From the properties panel, we can select a text color, and that will transfer to the fill. And then if we're in any other framework or plain HTML, we just simply would go to the styles panel and then go down to the text and select a color here. That would then transfer, if we have this checked, to the fill. Okay, so if we turn that back to black by unchecking this, basically what it's doing right now is it's actually filling that with the color that's set on the div that's before for any text. And since we haven't modified it, it defaults back to the body color, which is black. Now, if we click on this one, the stroke, this is basically selecting the color for the pen or crayon that's going to draw the line. In this case, this rectangle isn't really drawn with a line, so we won't see it changing, but on other objects we would. Okay, so we can see this a little bit better if we go over to this more complex one where there's plenty of paths to change, as we can see. Now, if we go ahead and click stroke with current color, you can see that that changes. We can go over to a danger, to a blue, to a white. So we can change our stroke color. The other way you can manipulate SVGs is you can take individual paths and change them. So for example, if we wanted this balloon to be red, we would actually pick this path and then go ahead and say fill with current stroke color, select red, and there we go. You could also do that, some other aspects, whatever aspects we want to fill with red. So that's a big advantage. And as with other DOM and elements, both the main SVG, so this very top SVG here, as well as any of the paths within, you can give them both class names and IDs. And this allows you to target either the whole SVG or portions to change color, for example, on hover, or to have click touch actions, or just basically to style them within your CSS style sheet, as opposed to inline as I'm doing now. The other thing that you can do by being able to give IDs is you can do things like build up a map where each area of the map, either a room or a store in a mall, has its own section of the SVG that you can give an ID to. Then you can have for example, a click event that when they click on that particular portion of the SVG, that it pops up a modal with more information about that store. One of the criticisms of inline SVG images is that they can't be cached. While this is true, they can be loaded once and then reused on the same page. This can be accomplished through two different sets of tags, the use tag and another set of tags, the defs tags. Both allow you to load and define an SVG image anywhere on the page, but then display it someplace else. This is very useful for large SVG images below the fold. That way the transfer of data doesn't block page display, but by the time the user scrolls to the image, it will have loaded. So it's a little bit like lazy loading of images. So to reuse an SVG image, or even part of an image, for example, in a file made up of a grid of SVG icons, you just need to add an ID to the portion you wish to use. So just going back to our simple rectangle, if we highlight that, we can add an ID to it. And now to reuse that same simple rectangle somewhere else, we can just search for the SVG element, go ahead and drag that over to our DOM tree. And if we reload, we can see that Pinegrow adds in this standard circle within the SVG. We can go in and get rid of that code and instead use the use tag. Now you can see that we've got a new square on our page. And so all we had to do that is, again, use the use tag, which is a self-closing tag, and then pass in our ID of reuse. So it has to have that hash in front of it in the form of a ref. So this is the newer form. It used to be an Xlink ref, and we don't need to do that anymore. We can just put it in a standard ref. You'll also notice that even though we're reusing this same one, this is a different size. And that's because if we look at the SVG height and width here, it's 100 by 100. Whereas the SVG height and width here is actually 200 by 200. So we can reuse our element, but we can resize them. The other thing that we can do is if we don't set a stroke or a fill on our primary one that we're reusing, we can then do that here. So we can say something like fill equals red. So reusing an SVG this way allows you to pass in several different attribute values. You can pass in the X, Y, width, height, and actually a ref within the SVG, and it's going to override values set on the original image. But anything like a fill or a stroke set on the original can't be overridden using the use tag. There is a way around this, however. So one thing that we can do is we could go back to our original SVG, and in order to set the styling within this rectangle, and this is primarily needed if you have something pretty complicated, we could use CSS variables. So I'm just going to add a style block, and I'm going to target the parent div of this SVG using a class. So first for the style block with the variables, and then I'll go back and add that class name onto the div, as well as using that those variables within my SVG itself. Now you can see we've given a color to our original one and still can have the red fill on the reused one. We can also, if we choose, change this to use a style block as well and pass in through variables. And then, of course, you can also go ahead and, instead of using that as an inline style, give this SVG or a div surrounding it a specific class or ID, and then put your variable values into your style sheet rather than inline. Just one other quick thing, if you have really complex SVGs like this one, one thing that you can do to be able to style it a little bit easier is you use something called a G tag. Basically, it just allows you to group large numbers of paths together. So you could say group all the balloon paths together and give it a class or ID to be able to style it. So as mentioned above, you can also use the defs tag to store SVG elements anywhere on the page. And to store an element, all you have to do is wrap that element. So we're talking here. Wrap that SVG element in another set of tags, a defs tag. So one thing about the defs tag is that it won't actually show the SVG that it wraps around at that particular place. You have to use it in conjunction with a use tag in order to get it to display. So once you have it wrapped, and if you have, in this case, as we do, an ID of reuse, then you have to use the use tag in order to display it. And so that's, again, pretty useful if you want to display your complex SVG image somewhere on the page, but you want to be able to load it in such a way that it doesn't block page load time. I could go ahead and define my SVG with the large amount of code that needs to be loaded in at the bottom of the page, and then actually issue my use further up the page and thus not break page loading. One other thing that we haven't talked about before is namespaces in SVG. So basically, if you look at an SVG, it usually has this XMLNS. That's the XML namespace. That XML namespace really for an HTTP document isn't necessary. It's only necessary if you're delivering this as an XML page. And for the most part, older browsers sort of need that, but any of the newer browsers don't need that. They also don't need the additional XML namespace of Xlink for using use. So that was an old specification, but you might see that either an XMLNS or an XMLNS:\Xlink, but they're not needed. So the only other thing that I'm just going to mention really quickly for using SVGs, something that's not that common, is something called preserve aspect ratio. And if you look in the properties box, you can actually go ahead and turn this on. And then when you look back at the code, you'll see that this now has this preserve aspect ratio attribute. By default, that preserve aspect ratio is set to a value of X min, Y min, meet. And basically, that just allows you, when you resize that SVG, to move it around within the viewport as well as cut off any overflow. And if you're interested in this topic, I encourage you to look at the written tutorial, as I have a better explanation of it near the end of that.